Hello and welcome to this third edition of Kyte Talks. For those of you that have joined us in previous sessions, you would know that we spoke about the DORA regulation, ISO 27001 standard. And today we have another very interesting topic. Today we speak about penetration testing. My name is Trevor and I'm the director at Kyte. So penetration testing, sometimes also referred to as ethical hacking, it has been around for a number of years. It is one of the most effective tools and techniques used by information security professionals. But with more and more regulation and standards that are making penetration testing a mandatory requirement, we're now seeing a lot of interest even from the non-technical community. So today's discussion is definitely going to be a very interesting one, where we discuss some of the technical, let's say, the details of what is penetration testing. So as with other sessions, I have three new guests with me today. Erim Bilgin, who is the head of penetration testing at Kyte. Roderick Caruana, who is the director of technology at MSL Edge, a fintech company. And Kyereh, who is a qualified security assessor also at Kyte. Guys, thank you very much for joining me. So we can start right away going into our discussion, and the first question, Erim, is for you. We're talking about penetration testing. What is a penetration test, right? What makes up a pen test? And yeah, there are a lot of misconceptions out there about what constitutes a proper pen test. What are we talking about?
Sure. Very simply, of course, you can have a very broad description of it, but in the most simplest way, penetration testing is running a sort of simulation of what a attacker geared with the latest knowledge and the techniques would be able to do against your organization, and running that simulation ideally in a safe test environment. So we're able to use the same tools and methods and everything that a real attacker would use to see where the security vulnerabilities are present. And then we can prepare detailed reports so that the organization can then go in and fix those vulnerabilities so that you're not caught unprepared. There's a lot of subtypes of it, of course, but in the most general description, I would say that's basically what it is.
Francis, that's a very good introduction and very good definition, but as I said, penetration testing has been getting a lot of attention lately, right? But why all this importance? What's the fuss about?
So the goal of pen testing is to determine how a malicious user can gain unauthorized access to assets that affect the fundamental security of the system, and to confirm these validations or vulnerabilities that regulations, standards such as PCI-QSA or ISO 27001 or GDPR, to validate the scope or the high-risk vulnerabilities or the segmentation or how the remediation controls are in place. This is the fundamental goal of penetration testing. Now, at the end of the day, the outcome of penetration testing is to help you identify the key vulnerabilities in discovering all the weaknesses in systems before attackers can do it. So you are being proactive in exploiting or knowing your own vulnerabilities before attackers come in. And this will help you to meet a lot of the compliance requirements, such as the GDPR or DORA or PCI-QSA. And again, it gives you the ability to take your organization through a real-world attack simulation, so you know how a real attacker can come into the environment. And it also supports you to improve your incident response mechanisms. So when you are planning for pen test, once the attackers simulate, you should be able to know if your response mechanisms are working accurately. So generally, these are the reasons or the importance of penetration tests.
Yeah. And when we talk about pen test, because it's actually a test, right? Is this one specific type of test? So what are we talking here? Are there different types, different flavors, different sizes of pen test? Francis or Erim?
Yeah, so there are different types of tests, as I indicated earlier, based on the standards or the regulations that we may be dealing with. For instance, if you pick PCI-DSS, the key types of penetration test required is internal penetration test, where the focus is on identifying the vulnerabilities within your internal network, which helps you to detect all the weaknesses that could be exploited by an attacker within the network. And then you have the second type of test required by PCI, which is external penetration testing, where you are attacking from the internet or external facing part of the network. There is segmentation testing, which allows you to test whether the segmentation controls are working properly. And generally, different types like web application penetration testing, mobile application penetration testing, API penetration testing. So there are different categories of pen test in various aspects of the IT infrastructure.
Yeah, we'll get into some of those further on in this discussion. Erim, you want to add anything to that?
Just to add, I mean, I could say Francis did a pretty good job of explaining all of that. I would say we also have social engineering type attacks. So these are attacks that take place more in the real world. So, and we can go into those later too.
Roderick, I'll bring you into this discussion. So we've been talking about why a pen test is important and the benefits. It obviously almost begs the question, then why aren't we doing it all the time, right? It looks like a very good thing to do. From your perspective, you obviously represent a fintech company and you work within the fintech/payment industry. What are those challenges that you would typically face and other companies would probably be facing as well in either performing the pen test, so when you get yourself organized to perform one of these tests, or conversely, why aren't companies doing it?
Sure. As mentioned by Francis, there are a lot of testing variety, and that comes at a cost, all right? So if you are a company, you need to have a budget for it, and you need to have the resources, the human resources, because it's useless to do a pen test and then you don't mitigate it, because to leave it on the shelf, then do nothing. So these two, human resources and costs, are a factor. That's what we see and what I've also experienced. Especially pen test if you are not binded to a certification, PCI, ISO. If you don't have that to get to the C level, get it approved, we need it. It's challenging, all right? Because they don't see the need. It's just an extra spend. That are two main factors that we have challenged.
Yeah, funny enough, you'd very easily get budget approval or finance when a particular case makes the news, right? And then you immediately get, yeah, and again, funnily enough, some of these cases don't even get reported, you know, so there's a certain amount of, let's say, ignorance about these attacks that are happening all around us. So yeah, I would imagine that cost is a very important factor, but it brings me into the next topic I want to talk about, which is what do you test, right? So, and it is a topic which we discussed even in the previous sessions we had around the scope, right? I imagine with the the cost factor in mind and with the compliance factor in mind that you need to test to be able to comply. The concept of scoping the exercise is very important, right? So how do we go about maybe identifying the scope for this test?
Yeah, I mean, as you're saying, depends on the compliance that you are looking forward. It's not that easy, right? Because if you have a large infrastructure, should we go through everything or not? So that's what we start. So first we identify why we are doing it. If it's compliance, okay. For PCI, which part of this infrastructure? Because it can be their parts which are not really require it. I mean, it's good to do it on everything, but to keep the cost down, you need to identify it. The scope, as I'm saying, you list. You need to work with your QSA, all right? You see what they are, and from there you take it. I mean, it's not.
Yeah.
We do it, but we try to be careful.
Erim, I know this topic is close to your heart, right?
Yeah. We don't want to test everything. That's very important because then I will cry a lot. Mm-hmm. So we want to keep it doable. But yeah, of course. I mean, it's it's always a question about, like you said, the QSA is mostly going to, when it comes to compliance-based tests, the QSA is going to guide you through and tell you, this needs to be tested more. So it's about criticality, to go through your assets and put them in an order of like this one's the most critical, and also communication. So which systems are talking to which systems? Is something here really isolated? Something here is much more critical. It might be holding client data and stuff like that. So we're always putting it in an order of criticality because, like you said, there's always budgetary concerns. We would like to, in an ideal world, be constantly testing everything, but we go from most important to least important, and we put other factors to isolate some of the systems that maybe not need to be tested and so on. Based on just people's questions to me, it seems like their girlfriend's Instagram account is usually the most critical target, that what they want hacked all the time. But yeah. So.
But we do quite a lot of pen tests, as you know, and we spend quite a bit of time discussing and agreeing the scope with the client, right? One, because it's important for us to make sure that it's covering the scope that is under, let's say, under audit as far as the requirements go. But also because very often the clients either do not do a good job at defining their own scope, right? Or sometimes we have to ask even more questions to get to the bottom of what's behind this IP address or behind this URL. Anything you can maybe add to help reduce, let's say, those common mistakes?
Yeah, absolutely. So over the years, I've seen that, unfortunately, compliance descriptions are often lacking a little bit in terms of how well they describe how and what needs to be tested in what way. So for example, sometimes they will just tell you need to do an internal test and an external test, and like not much more than that, and then what does that even mean? External, internal, it gives me some idea of what that could entail, but not exactly. And sometimes, I will see a scope sent by a client and, the initial version, the first draft of the scope, and just by the look of it, you can see there's a URL, for example, /login, and there's no mention of authentication. Does this test need to be done with user accounts? Do you have a payment system? Do you own that payment system, or is it a third party? So there are certain criteria. Obviously, at the end of the day, we want to know the addresses, the URLs, the IPs that we're going to be going to. And that usually determines the size of the test. Obviously, the more hosts you have, the more websites you have, the bigger the test is. But on a fundamental level, when we're doing the test, just saying, oh, this is external and this is internal, usually doesn't cover it. But when you work with a penetration testing team, they will be able to guide you through the process. Yes, you have this site, it requires authentication. So let me ask you how many types of users you have. You have admins, moderators, like these different levels of users. We need to be ideally testing from all of those perspectives. So yeah, there are a lot of things like this that the compliance, descriptions don't really mention, but to do a good job and to do a really thorough job, you have to take those things into account.
Of course, because as you said at the beginning, if you don't do it, then of course the attackers themselves are trying to do the same thing.
Care about that,
Roderick, you're from the, let's say, banking fintech side. Anything particular about a particular pen test you think you need to maybe treat it in a different way? Like you have a core banking system, for example. Do you approach a pen test in any particular way?
Yes, I mean, it will depend. If you have a portal or if you have an API, these are two different type of testing. When you have portal, the pen testing needs to be looked if there is data exposure, for example, into that cases. And that's why the job of the pen tester to help us as a company to find these issues, because there can be developers that not maliciously, by a mistake, or foresight, they don't do it. So we approach in different ways. We look also, for example, at our regulations, data privacy, and so on. So we need to make sure if there is an exposure or something to a vulnerability, we look into that particular exposure, if we have been exposed previously and we didn't know. So we do much more checks into this scenario. In relation to APIs, as you mentioned, we need to attend and give as much information so that, make it help out the pen tester doing a much better job. All right.
Yeah, you mentioned APIs. I think it's one of those areas where very often overlooked, because an API almost does not appear anywhere on a network diagram, right? It's almost a hidden application. Francis, with open banking and the widespread use of APIs, as we're saying, how from an IT auditor, how would you expect the pen test, to be approached, and are there any challenges to making sure that the testing of all these APIs are done properly?
So, Trevor, Gartner estimates that by 2027, 87% of internet traffic will be passing through APIs. And what I've observed on the field, reviewing or examining a lot of firewall rules, configurations, you see only a few rules, and one of them is HTTPS, and other few rules. Now, the good thing is all the traffic, API traffic, is passing through HTTPS. So that means now they are outside the visibility of the firewall, right? But the use of APIs being the data carrier, the traffic carrier, now means that a lot of emphasis have to be put on the APIs and API security. So penetration testers like Erim would have to do a lot of work in different approaches, so adopting different approaches that will help them to identify the secure implementation of APIs by different organizations. Now, there are three main issues around APIs that I want to emphasize. One of them is the broader attack surface. Now, you have open banking APIs, widespread use of APIs, and these have exposed, most of the time, they've exposed these APIs to third parties. So the attack surface is no longer your organization's attack surface, but different entities that have connected through your APIs. Once they are breached, it means your environment is also at risk. Another one is when pen testers must focus on the API security, API authentication mechanisms that have been implemented to ensure the permissions, authorizations that have been given those APIs meet these security specifications. Another broad area that always have to be considered about APIs is the third-party integration testing, where the security posture of all those third-party integrations must be evaluated to ensure that those third parties are not, carrying certain risk into your own technical environment.
Very good. There are a lot of things I would like to go through, but maybe to close the topic of the scoping, which obviously comes as a task before we actually start testing. Another important, I suppose, subject is preparing for the test, right? So, I mean, one of the things we need to have in place before we actually start the test is obviously understanding our assets, right, and preparing ourselves for the test. What goes on during the preparation state, let's say, of the test, and both from the tester side, and what do we expect the entity being tested to prepare and have things in place. So what would be your recommendations there? And I suppose it's a question
Shall I go first? Okay. I will say it's more than anything, it's an inventorying exercise, right? And honestly, even if you weren't going to do a pen test for some reason, I think it's really healthy to go through that maybe annually, because you will realize that you have assets that you're not even aware of. Like sometimes people forget some of the systems they have. So it's an inventory exercise. You go through what you have, of course, with the QSA and the pen test team holding your hand, you go through the process. And once it's determined, okay, these are the systems we want to test. From our side, we do what we call the access stage of the onboarding process, which is where we get all the details we need to get to establish the right amount of access to that scope. So if you have an internal network, we're going to request you give us a VPN and SSH connection into that internal network. If you have a web application, we're going to require testing accounts, maybe a staging environment where we can safely test. If you have payment systems, we might ask for example payment methods that we can use. We mentioned APIs a lot, and everything that I wanted to say has already been pretty much said. But for APIs, one of the things that's different, for example, is because sometimes they don't have a UI component, they don't have a visual component, they're data only sometimes. With a website, for example, we can just kind of click around and see how things work. But with an API, what we do is we do a demo with the client to run us through the API, show us how it normally works, so we get a good understanding to supplement the documentation. So we get the scope, we go through the inventory to figure out what the scope is, we get the access, we confirm it as working, and then that's it. That's it.
Roderick, from your side, I was going to say, he's talking from the tester side. Yeah. You have to have some things prepared, right?
Yeah, but I mean, it's covered as well, as I'm saying. I mean, inventory list, it is important not just for the pen test, but even for ourselves. As mentioned clearly, in past we even forgot, that's the reality, of items when we didn't have it. So today, that's always updated, and instead having it every year updated, I see constantly. When you are doing a change to the infrastructure, add it, or to the software, adding a new piece of software, add it in there, because it's not just infrastructure we are talking here, it's the software as well. So for me, that's the first part that we'll be doing. And secondly, giving access, it will go through our rigorous same access level. So it's not kind of the pen tester, we don't really care. I mean, we pass through the same things.
Do you have challenges in providing, let's say, the access that Erim is talking about in terms of what he needs to get that test done? I suppose you have the production, the staging, the test, where you have to decide what access you're going to give. Are there challenges from your side?
No, I mean, there isn't any challenges. I mean, this part, or you give access or you don't. So if we need it, and it's for our own importance. It's not just to have the certification, but it's for our security that we give Erim or whoever pen tester the access level needed so that he really does a good job, that he
To simulate the
attacker, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Otherwise, we will not do it. I mean,
very good. Erim, in performing the pen test, I mean, I think we can all agree that what we see in the movies as far as an actual hacking attempt, right? Those things don't actually exist. But still, you use some pretty cool stuff as far as tools and techniques, right? Maybe you can go through some of them, let's say, your arsenal of tools.
You have to have your hoodie on. You have to have your hoodie and your gloves on in a dark room. That's essential. Yeah, of course, there's a lot of tools, you know.
And sorry to interrupt, but of course, this is also an important topic because there's a lot of misconception around whether a pen test is completely automated or not, whether it's a manual or just using a few tools, right?
Yeah.
Which is not the case.
Yeah. Can I just run a scan and call it a day? You know, no. There's a lot of different tools. It's a constantly evolving market. You know, you can't even keep track of it, honestly. And in fact, like we do kind of monthly meetings with some of my team members where we go through some of the newest released tools to see what we can employ into our methodology. But you know, there's open source tools, there's enterprise tools that we use, and of course automated versus manual. So most of the time what we end up doing is we don't have a distinction between open source and enterprise. What we're looking for is it a mature tool? Will it leave us, you know, empty-handed in the middle of the test? Will it crash on us? We want these kind of old time-honored tools more than anything. So we go with things like Nmap, Netcat, Burp Suite. These are the tools that I would take to a deserted island to do a pen test because I have no imagination. But you know, in terms of workflow, how we use these tools, usually we'll start with an automated scan. So we use both of them. And while that scan gives us kind of the lay of the land really quickly, it will give us some of the low-hanging fruit, some easy things to detect. And while those scans are running, we start to do more and more customized scans. So we're doing more as we understand the target. And as those are running, because they sometimes take a long time to run, we do some more manual stuff. We start interacting with the systems more manually. So that's basically what I can say. You know, we go from general to more detailed, scan to manual, and yeah, we try to use the effective tools.
And again, we mentioned it before. Would you say the hackers out there are doing the same exact thing in terms of the tools?
We use the exact same tools. The exact same tools that hackers are using, yeah. There's no...
And you're mentioning the tools and techniques, and of course we cannot not mention the skills behind it, right? But I won't ask you because you're biased in this case. Roderick, would you suggest a company to have their own testers and train them and get them in a position to be able to do this maybe on a more regular basis, or would you still suggest looking for a specialized firm to do this?
Well, ideally, it's an ongoing process, all right? So if it is something internally that you have budget for and you have the people, yes, I would say go for it. But when you go for reality, we can't support that, because if you have this team, it's not just the pen tester, you need as well the resources to mitigate it. So the costs start going higher. Based on that factors, I mean, kind of, let's leave the company do its core functionality, what we know much about, which is finance, and let's hire a service provider which can do that job. Apart that, then we try, you know, to see as well if we can automate ourselves something to help. I mean, a little bit kind of so that we don't leave it for a long time, because otherwise, you know, change is happening every day, software and infrastructure.
Yeah. And in terms of, yeah, again, it's something which we hear very often. There's a difference between, or at least the perception out there is that hackers are more interested in more high value targets, let's say. So I'm a small company, they're not really interested in hacking me. Is there any truth in this?
I would say that is absolutely the exact opposite of the truth. So one of the big things that I think is a big eye-opener for people who have this misconception is hackers don't target companies arbitrarily. Maybe that's the wrong way of saying it, but they don't just like go look at, okay, who's close to me, or it's not about like a personal vendetta that they have with a company. You don't have to be like a big juicy target for them to go after you. How attacks usually happen and how people get targeted usually is there are these services that scan the entire internet. Anything that is externally facing, looking outside to the internet, they get scanned and they get compiled in a database, and this kind of stuff is open. You can go in and check, and what happens is a hacker will have mastery of a certain vulnerability, how to exploit it, and then they will go look at these scans of the internet to see, okay, who has this vulnerability? So it goes the exact opposite. Like you start with a key and then you look for a lock that fits your key. So if you happen to have one of those vulnerabilities that a random hacker might know how to exploit, you're going to be on their list because that's more low risk, high reward for them. And actually, if you're a smaller firm, because the hacker now has a list of, let's say, 50 companies that they want to check. If you're a smaller company, they're going to assume that you probably don't have the means, the resources to defend yourself against something like this. So it's going to be easier to hack you. So you're more likely to be on the chopping block.
And a small company does not necessarily mean small amount of data as well, right?
Absolutely not.
Still a very high value target.
Something to add. I mean, we have experienced what Erim is saying. In fact, for example, when we launch services on our cloud provider, as soon as we launch them and it's a public IP, for example, we start seeing it immediately being attacked. Obviously, we are picking everything and we have WAPs and so on, and that's when we see it. So it's definitely something.
They, as you're saying, and as Erim was explaining, they're not necessarily targeting you. You just happen to be on the internet and potentially fit the profile of what exactly they're looking for, right?
Because you are located in IP. The IPs of the cloud providers are known, where they are, which regions, which piece of service are they. So it's quite easy for them, to have something running there all the time, and that's it.
Erim, take us very, very quickly. Take us through what is a typical attack, right? So you're trying to break things usually, right? And simulating that, but in real life, how would an attack look?
Mm-hmm. So these days, the most common type of attack we see usually starts with a social engineering attack. So an attacker will send somebody like a malicious link or a file. It can be an Office file with a macro running on it. And they will somehow get access by running this kind of code on your computer, or they will harvest your credentials by pointing you to a fake site. And they will wait a little bit after obtaining that access. And then, they might get into your internal network. Another thing we see is if you have external facing assets like a website, there might be a lack of input validation. So they might inject something into your site that silently sits there and listens to genuine users' traffic. So all of this, of course, is possible when they're able to execute code on your system. So, throughout a pen test, we check for these various layers of security so that ideally, even if someone gets into your internal network, they shouldn't be able to progress much more than that, because you should have like different levels of authorization. So, does that answer your question? I think, yeah.
And in doing a pen test, because I think this is quite a curious, let's say, question that some people might have out there. Do you typically find things? Or are we doing tests and then maybe coming up with something? Or we actually do find some juicy stuff sometimes in terms of vulnerabilities?
Yeah, all the time, yeah. It's
and
actually,
serious ones?
I will say, you know what? Yes, we do find very serious vulnerabilities, but actually compared to how it was when I first got into this business, it's kind of dried up. Like, it's not as exciting as it used to be. I remember tests where we would find like an old Counter-Strike server, like a laptop that the IT guy was playing Counter-Strike on in the server room that was directly connected to the local network. So, or like really one-click hacks.
The type of vulnerabilities have
It has matured.
Changed,
The
right.
overall environment has matured. It's less common that you will find like criticals flying everywhere. It's less common.
But in terms of a report that you'd pass on to management, there are typically
there's still so
critical
many
and high risk ones, right?
Yeah. And sometimes fun things, but yeah.
Yeah, fun things for you, I suppose. But Francis, we find vulnerabilities. That report comes to management. How do we go about addressing the vulnerabilities, and of course, then let's say getting better after that?
So the response is risk mitigation, remediation, patching, right? So the reports have been received on all the high, critical, medium vulnerabilities or risks, weaknesses that have been identified by the pen testing team. So the implementation team or the operational team is to put in place measures to mitigate or remediate these vulnerabilities. Now, on the field, there are three main approaches that we've observed. The first one is the traditional remediation or patch management process, where the organization would have a patch management platform and will initiate a change process where the vulnerabilities are patched according to the traditional CVSS scores that were assigned to them. But when it might be possible today, maybe in a bank, to patch every Windows system within 3 days. But the risk is you might cause business disruption, which might be unacceptable. So how do we move from the challenges with the traditional patching process to a more engaging risk prioritization process? Again, on the field, some of the entities have introduced this new concept of vulnerability prioritization technologies, VPTs, where there are additional tools beside the traditional vulnerability assessment tools, which integrate with the vulnerability assessment tools and is able to give a ranking or an idea of the priority of a particular vulnerability. So sometimes the vulnerability may be a medium, but in terms of prioritization, if you patch that vulnerability, you may defend the organization more than maybe even if you patched a high scoring vulnerability. So a lot of entities are moving away from the traditional remediation or patch management process and are maturing or attaching the risk-based vulnerability prioritization technologies to improve the traditional process. The third type of remediation approach we are seeing on the field is also the continuous threat exposure management, where the patch management process is seen not as a event-based, maybe weekly, monthly, quarterly, but a continuous threat exposure management. And there are a lot of platforms or tools on the market today that support continuous threat exposure management.
Very good. Erim, the last word to you, very, very quickly. We spoke about tools, but there are a lot of emerging trends as far as pen testing goes, different techniques. AI is showing its face everywhere now, so I presume it's also getting into penetration testing. There's also a lot of interest in performing not only the technical tests, but also physical penetration tests. Anything you can share?
Yeah, and those topics tie into each other actually very quickly. Of course, everybody is afraid that AI is going to take over everything. And I actually do believe that in the near future it will happen, but right now that's not the case. Currently, the AI systems, they're giving a lot of false positives. They're unable to deal with the human element. There's also the risk, of course, that a lot of these AIs are managed by third parties, and when you interact with them, your data gets fed into the AI to train the next iteration of the AI. So, and that's a lot of proprietary info, so you don't want to be doing that. And the way it ties in with the other question is the human element. Well, obviously, the AI is not going to be able to walk into your office, pretend to be a cable guy, and like plug in a device, which is like a red teaming exercise, a physical test, which is another thing that we do. AI's so far is unable to do that. So maybe in the near future that might be the case. Currently, that's not the case. Yeah, it's hype for now.
Yeah. For now, you definitely have a job for the
I am
foreseeable
employed
future.
for the foreseeable
Very
future.
good.
Yeah.
Guys, that's all the time we had for today. I wish we could go into more topics on the subject, but that was very interesting. Thank you very much for joining me and for being here. Thank you everyone for joining us on this edition of Kyte Talks.